Nice to be here today, and it is a very timely topic for our discussion. We just celebrated NATO's 75th anniversary yesterday in Brussels, and we are about to have elections for the European Parliament in a few weeks, the NATO summit in Washington in July, and elections in the United States in early November. So at the end of the year, the teams in charge of transatlantic relations can be, if not radically changed, at least updated in terms of mandate, and there will be a new reality we will be confronted with. And it will be very interesting already now, today, to discuss what that reality might be at that point in time. The panel is formed by Keir Lieber, Chiara Ruffa, and Brian Rich. You can see them on the screen. And the battle plan for our discussion is the following. I will give each of them 10-15 minutes for introductory remarks. I will immediately react with a comment or a question to their introduction, and then move on to the following speaker. And after this first round of 1+1, I will open the floor for your comments and questions so that we can have as interactive as possible a session this afternoon. So without any further ado, I will give the floor first to Keir Lieber, who will talk about the challenges and the threats that affect the current transatlantic security defense landscape. Keir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'll try and be brief and direct and to the point. I think my overall argument is that the future of transatlantic security cooperation looks pretty bleak. I'm quite pessimistic about the future. I hate to say this. I know it's good feelings in the room, and Georgetown, Sciences Po, and I love Europe, and I want to keep coming, but I see trouble ahead, and specifically I'm going to make 3 points. There are 3 major threats to that transatlantic security relationship. The first one is that the United States is not going to play the same leadership role, either in leading NATO and European security efforts, or even supporting them in the way that the United States has in the past. The second point is that European national security interests, so intra-European national security interests, will continue to diverge, exacerbating the absence of the U.S. role. And then third, the disaster of the Ukraine war will reverberate in ways that are not going to lead to a healthy transatlantic security cooperative relationship. For each of these, I'll explain each in just a little bit more detail. I'll offer a glimmer of optimism. It's my nature. I'm a happy person, and I want to see the silver lining. But it will require a lot of hard adjustments. I'll try to even offer some policy recommendations that at the very end, again, to try and end on a good note. But to go back to the bad notes, first of all, the United States, regardless of who wins the presidential election in November, is going to be increasingly disengaged from Europe and perceived European security matters. So first, let's start with the really bad prospect that Donald Trump, inshallah, does not win. But let's say Donald Trump wins the election. I don't think I need to do much convincing to my European colleagues that this is very bad news for the transatlantic relationship. You had his most recent comment that Russia can do whatever the hell it wants, meaning invade, a NATO country if that NATO country doesn't pay its bills, doesn't pay its security bills, meaning the 2% of defense spending target. He admires Putin more than he admires any other democratic leader in Europe. It's really stunning. And most importantly, his base, his supporters in the United States are skeptical of the costs that a NATO relationship brings and are skeptical of the benefits. It's not even that the costs are worth the benefits. They don't even see the benefit of a transatlantic security relationship. So look, all bad news there. Forget about it if somehow he wins. If Biden wins, it's still not great news. And the reality is the United States is pivoting to China. There's one and only primary security threat to the U.S. in the minds of U.S. leaders and the public, and that's China. There are three regions of the world the United States cares about and has cared about: Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. And Europe is a distant third in that ranking in reality. China is extremely important. Containing China, the future is driven by the rise of a peer competitor and the need to contain that competitor, which has been a long-standing tradition in American grand strategy. The Middle East increased, still important, mainly for oil, but other reasons: instability, fighting terrorism, et cetera. And I just think it's worth being honest about where Europe ranks in the U.S. list of priorities. There is also, even if Biden wins, significant domestic U.S. skepticism about the burdens and benefits of a transatlantic security relationship. What I'm getting at here is what we're seeing in the U.S. is part of a broader crisis for the U.S.-led liberal world order. So the Biden administration still has plenty of liberal internationalists, Blinken, et cetera, who value the relationship with Europe and think that we're walking in lockstep. But the problem is, and I'll just be honest, I think those liberal internationalists that have run U.S. foreign policy for the last decades have led us into some disastrous foreign policy experiences. In the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and in our involvement in Syria, the American people are wondering what's the point of this? Why should we be the leader of the world, much less, the leader in Europe, where you've got Germany and France and others? Why can't they bear the burden? Again, it's not just a Trump phenomenon, although I hate to be associated with anything, having to do with Trump at this point, but I think there's a good point. There's real reasons for that argument. Okay, I said there was going to be some good news. So the good news on this issue is that hopefully Biden's going to win. That's it. I think he will. I mean, how could anybody vote for Trump that didn't vote for him before? And he didn't get enough votes before. How is it possible? I don't know. Somebody here can tell me maybe. But anyways, the good news is maybe Biden will win. Maybe that will help sustain the current transatlantic relationship as long as possible. But again, I'm being a bit facetious there because I see big trouble. Second big problem is that intra-European divergence of interest that I spoke of. Simply put, Belgium and Italy don't care about the same problems that Estonia and Poland care about, right? Estonia and Poland do care about Russia, and is there a threat from Russia? Italy doesn't care. They care about migration issues, right? France, okay, I won't mention France. I don't know. I don't want to tell you what you think. My Belgian friends tell me they don't really think that Russia, is a threat. Whether it is or not, and I'll come back to that in a second, just understand that that is a total recipe for inaction and bitter disputes about burden sharing if you don't even share the same identification of the same goals, right? It's one thing to identify shared interests and split the burden, but you take 27 European countries, 32 in NATO, with U.S. disengagement, and that is an incredible exacerbation of the collective action problem that's at the heart of NATO. I don't see how that gets any better, and I think it's going to get a lot worse. Good news here. I've kind of been saying what's the point of NATO and the demise of NATO and the end of the transatlantic relationship for decades, and it's still alive, so who am I to say predict the future here? The good news is I'm not a good predictor of the demise of NATO because it's persisted. I mean, ever since the end of the Cold War. So my radar may be off, I may be missing something, but I don't see a whole lot of room for sustained cooperation moving forward, particularly in the absence of the U.S. leadership role. That brings me to the third topic, the happy topic of Ukraine. Aside from the issue, although I'm happy to talk about it, of the degree to which we are responsible, that this is a tragedy of our own making, okay? Because I believe that NATO expansion, enlargement, if you want me to call it that, was a significant driver of Russian behavior and its decision to invade Ukraine. That's my view. I mean, I'm happy to argue with anybody. I think it behooves us to understand a little bit more about how Russian insecurity in the face of NATO's actions may have contributed to its aggression. I completely blame Putin and all of the rest, but aside from that issue, it's been an unmitigated disaster, which will only undermine future cooperative security action. United States support for Ukraine is dwindling. We can't even get the last bill approved in the Congress to supply arms. European actions are not measuring up to their rhetoric. Everybody talks a big game about helping the Ukrainians, and yet you're not getting the production and supply of weapons and things that they need. Ukraine is struggling to recruit enough troops just to keep the status quo, just to maintain this awful stalemate. And then meanwhile, Russia has almost completely reconstituted its army, has a massive superiority in weapons and manpower, and is poised to take more territorial gains. In short, Ukraine is going to lose this war. Russia, in any sense of the word, is going to prevail, is going to win. And so you might not think I have any good news here, but I do have some good news. Two quick ones. First, if Russia were losing in Ukraine, that would be really bad because then they might use nuclear weapons. In other words, if those Ukrainian counteroffensives had succeeded and almost pushed Russia out of the Donbass and back, this would be seen as an existential threat to the Putin regime. And Putin's threats about using nuclear weapons would actually have a lot of logic and incentive behind it. Use a bunch of nuclear weapons, a few nuclear weapons against Ukrainian troops, and say, stop supporting Ukraine or else I'll use more. And guess what? There's no good response to that. What's the response? You're going to nuke Moscow? The United States or France are going to use nuclear weapons again? No. They're going to use, tit for tat, do what they do in Ukraine? What's the theory of victory there? I'm sort of surprised that Putin didn't use nuclear weapons when he was losing badly. There's an incentive, a logic to escalation that I'm happy to explain more if you like, but that's the good news, that we're not winning in Ukraine. The real maybe good news here is that Russia is, to counter the Prime Minister's comments this morning, I do not believe that Russia is an existential threat to Europe. I do not think that Putin is poised to invade Estonia or Poland, particularly now that in the wake of the experience in Ukraine. I do not, this is my view, you're welcome to your own view, I see some skeptical faces. You need to make the argument that Putin has territorial designs on NATO territory. Ukraine was not a part of NATO, right? And I don't think he has the stomach for that. And if you believe he does, then you need to make that case and lay it out. So very quickly, conclusions, and then I'll wrap up. I think what we need to do is we need to help convince Ukraine to negotiate a settlement before they lose even more territory. As I said, the war is lost. The best that we're going to get is a frozen peace. It will probably require twisting the arms of the Ukrainians, but I'm a realist. That's what I think we need to do. As part of that, the second recommendation, the only thing I can think of, is to undertake an honest appraisal of what are the threats to Europe, the actual military threats or other threats, and only then can you begin to tackle the issues of burden sharing within NATO, within this main security alliance in Europe. Those burdens may be too great if we overinflate the threat. If the threat is actually that Russia is not a major challenge to Europe, then it might require less weight to bear, which is going to get more and more difficult because the United States is going to be more and more withdrawn. Thank you.
Thank you, Keir. I mean, you have covered a lot of ground, and I would be tempted myself to react immediately to some of your points, but I'm sure that the debate will offer ample opportunities to the audience to do that. I would like only to pick up on one point from your remarks, that is the nuclear issue. because after all, it is in principle the biggest threat we are confronted with in terms of European and transatlantic security. Now, to my knowledge, Vladimir Putin has waived the nuclear threat 3 times so far. Once at the beginning of the war, in order to intimidate the West not to support Ukraine. Well, it hasn't worked particularly well. I personally believe that on that first occasion, the US and Western reaction was very good. You know, deterrence is also about communication, and the communication that was generated would be a very grave action, and will respond not necessarily with the same means. So not necessarily with a nuclear weapon, depending also, of course, on the scope and the intensity of the possible action undertaken by Russia. The second time was when Russia was in trouble on the battleground. It was in the autumn of 2022 when the Ukrainians were pushing back. And that was a defensive situation. And on that occasion, it was not the US or the West who rebuked Putin, it was Xi Jinping. It was Beijing. They clearly sent a message, drop that kind of conversation. And this time around, Russia is feeling that it has wind in its sails on the battleground. So one wonders why this has been raised at this stage. There has been not much reaction in Western capitals to this one. Maybe Putin is sending another type of message that is not necessarily related to the war. I personally believe, and I would like to have your take, that the underlying issue is more New START. You know, New START is the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty still in place and is going to expire next year. After that, there will be no nuclear arms control arrangement or regime anywhere in the world. And there have already been exchanges between Washington and Moscow in this particular respect. And of course, there is a presidential campaign now almost underway in the United States. So it will be interesting to have your take on that kind of situation. My impression is that there is communication between Moscow and Washington on this and else. Even if you like the episode of the terrorist attack at the Crocus Mall in Concert Hall and the mall in Moscow showed that there was communication, that the CIA was feeding Moscow with important information about a possible terrorist attack. So we are less concerned this time around, but there is a more strategic concern for a few months from now with New START. What is your take on that?
Okay, again, I'm not trying to make any friends here, so I'll just say I don't think arms control matters, and I don't think policy statements really matter that much when it comes to issues of nuclear escalation, which are driven by strategic calculations and strategic interests. Okay, I'm amazed whenever nuclear conversations come up in the United States. Will so-and-so leader use nuclear weapons? Will Putin use nuclear weapons? Will Kim Jong-un use nuclear weapons? It's always one of two things. Either, no, those threats are just a bluff. They're empty threats. It's rhetoric. They never would do that. Why would they never do that? Because the United States and NATO has nuclear weapons and would retaliate, and no one wants to commit suicide. That's one response. The other response is, yeah, they would because they're crazy, they're delusional, right? That Putin is, so aggressive and driven by anger, he would use nuclear weapons. What about the middle? What about the baseline? Just rational calculations of interest, okay? Remember, in the Cold War, NATO was going to use nuclear weapons first, particularly in the first half of the Cold War. If the Soviet Union had invaded Western Europe, it was our policy, our stated strategy, we made plans for it, to escalate to nuclear war. Why? Because they would have won the conventional conflict. We would have to do another Dunkirk and pull out of Europe and then fight our way back. We relied on nuclear weapons. We wanted to make sure that nuclear weapons would be used. We placed 21 different types of nuclear weapons all over Western Europe, and particularly in West Germany. 7,300 nuclear weapons. We wanted to make war automatic, right? Now, we might have been delusional and irresponsible. It might have been an empty bluff. I certainly don't think it was that, because war would have happened. The point is that we faced an existential threat. When we faced an existential threat, we relied on first use of nuclear weapons. If Putin believes that losing Ukraine is an existential threat, and again, I think we've moved away from that, so I am less concerned about the nuclear escalation problem right now. But if He believes he's going to lose Ukraine. Is that a threat to the Putin regime, to himself? Yeah, probably a coup, uprising, whatever. I have the same worry about if China loses a war over Taiwan. Would China escalate to nuclear use because the loss of China would be an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party? Korean Peninsula, an easy one. If Kim Jong-un fights a war against the United States and South Korea, he will lose that war very quickly at the conventional level. The only thing that makes sense, rational logic of nuclear escalation. And if you ask yourself, you think that's crazy, what is the best response to that? There's no good response. And the reason there's no good response to nuclear escalation is because it's a smart strategy. And Putin knows that. So again, yes, Jake Sullivan made threats to, massive conventional strikes against Russian targets. It's about the best we could do because we're certainly not going to threaten nuclear. We would like him to believe that we would retaliate with nuclear weapons. But I see the loss of Ukraine for Putin, existential threat, leading to nuclear escalation, which ends the war, which leads to the demise of NATO. So I can't say that I'm rooting for a Ukrainian victory.
Thank you very much, and to be continued, I'm sure, also on other topics. So we move on to Chiara. We'll probably focus more on the opportunities or the alternative options to the current international situation. Chiara.
Hi, everybody, and many thanks for inviting me here. I think I also have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that I'm not a realist, so I disagree on some of the things that have been said. The good news is that unfortunately I share quite a lot of Kier's perspectives as well. So I'm gonna start by basically, my starting point is that the fact that the war in Ukraine has been very much a wake-up call for the transatlantic alliance and particularly for Europe. And such wake-up calls made particularly Europe realize that we need more weapons, we need to arm and deter a war that is portrayed as very much looming, close, and inevitable. But in this conversation, I think that there are 2 points that are often missed, and these are the points that I would like to bring to the conversation today. So the first one is that there are additions and hopefully alternatives at some point in the medium-long term to deterrence that should not be overlooked, even in the case of Ukraine. And the second point is that there is a risk of overlooking how the alliance fares in relation to the rest of the world. So the really big risk for me here is that the transatlantic alliance and NATO in particular becomes this organization that, I agree with Kier, that actually doesn't die, but that becomes irrelevant, and that becomes inward-looking and ultimately unable to act for stability. While what it needs to do is that it needs to be, for sure it needs to pump up deterrence, but also simultaneously build bridges, and I'll tell you how to do it. So my first point is that, as I said, there are additions to deterrence that should not be overlooked, even in the case of Ukraine. So the situation in Ukraine is obviously dire, and my argument would, it seems pretty clear to me at least that that war is basically unwinnable. And that's really, really bad news. But it seems clear, and this has 3 components, right? The first one is that, at least for me, it seems clear that Russia, at least on the conventional level, does not want to escalate beyond Ukraine. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because if it had wanted to escalate, it would have, for instance, attacked lines of logistical supports coming from Western Europe in Western Ukraine. It never did it. And the second, when we can think about missile landing in Poland, Russia went out of its way to clarify what actually happened. The second component of this reasoning is that NATO has no intention to intervene directly, very clearly in Ukraine. So the likely situation is that it will continue to provide more weapons and support, but always staying very carefully out of this. And we are likely to remain in this situation in which NATO countries are providing material, logistical support, including the suggestion that I think came in yesterday from Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, to provide long-term aid via NATO instead of via this Ramstein system that we have. So, however, this leads me to my third observation. On the ground, at the tactical operational level, we are left with Russian troops that are making progress, with with a potential offensive that is likely to come in the summer, and the Ukrainian defense forces that are in a state of profound disarray and difficulty, notwithstanding amazing drive, amazing courage, amazing motivation. The reality on the ground is extremely dire. Units on the front lines are disconnected, cohesion is broken, notwithstanding heroism that we are seeing. And why is that? Well, it's because this, the ability of the Russians to reorganize is being quite remarkable. One of my PhD students is doing ethnographic work on the Ukrainian Defense Forces, and he was telling me about yet another problem that is often not talked about, which is the problem of the fact that, there is not enough, of course, substitution of personnel on the front lines, and this terrible situation with traumatized personnel, to the point that sometimes there are these traumatized soldiers that arrive in Kiev, and they need to get, help for post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're not able to talk to a psychiatrist, but they have to go via other alternative kinds of therapies, such as with horses that are more adapted in situations in which the trauma is particularly severe. So this is the situation on the ground. It's a humanitarian and human situation that I would just like to make visible, because we are not, as Europeans, as NATO, as the Transatlantic Alliance, we are not going to address this by sending in more weapons. So what the Ukrainian Defense Forces would actually need would be support on the ground, which NATO is unlikely to give, which is unlikely to come. So perhaps we need to think about other forms of training, maybe constitution and push for special forces, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. But with just more weapons being shipped in, Ukrainians are likely to win the war or even to reconquer any territory. So in this extremely volatile context, deterrence is important but hard to build for Europeans, of course, particularly. Because they have not done that for a while, and for European countries. But what I think, maybe I also disagree with you, Keir, is the fact that I think that Europeans have already chosen to work on more deterrence, to build up their strategic autonomy from the United States. So deterrence, however, like from a practical point of view, is not easy to build. There are several obstacles that are in the way to build up European capacities. There is not enough volume in terms of building up the force, even with the most recent NATO enlargement with Sweden and Finland. It's still, the defense industry is very fragmented. The institutional setup is extremely difficult. So this is going to take time. So even if there is goodwill for strategic autonomy, it's going to take some time to build it up. And I do believe that if deterrence becomes the only focus of the Transatlantic Alliance, and continuing with this external support to Ukraine, there is a real risk of becoming overly obsessed with that and risking really over-militarizing and becoming too war-ready without necessarily increasing preparedness for a threat, and ultimately missing other opportunities. That is something I'm going to talk about now as my third point on this first point, general point. So precisely because, as I said, this war in Ukraine is really, in my view, the situation is extremely dire, also from a human point of view. And deterrence, and ultimately unwinnable probably, and deterrence is kind of hard to achieve, which were my two first points. The Transatlantic Alliance should not overlook additions to deterrence. So we too often, particularly in Europe, I would say, in the past months, we consider a bit too easily war as a natural state of things. I do not think we should make compromises with Russia at all. But we should continue to explore various diplomatic options, including talks and negotiations, and we know that they're probably already happening, perhaps, and really explore alternative options, think a little bit outside the box. So how can we strike that balance between not giving territorial concessions and stop this slaughtering, this terrible situation on the tactical operational level that we are partly responsible for? So I think that exploring options at the United Nations is kind of interesting. For instance, we could think about developing perhaps a United Nations mission around a line of separation, a dividing line from the territory that is currently occupied by Russia and a territory that is still, Ukrainian territory and occupied the Ukraine without allowing for territorial concessions, right? So that's the crucial point here. If one looks closely at this situation, there are some interesting parallels with the current frozen conflict between Israel and Lebanon. And I think maybe we could think about this kind of frozen conflict situation that, it would not be solved, but at least we would avoid the current situation on the ground and the current suffering that we are seeing on the ground. Since 1978, in southern Lebanon and north of Israel, there's been no ceasefire agreement, but simply a line of separation, the so-called blue line, that signifies the line of withdrawal of Israel from Lebanese territory. And Israel, admittedly, has not completely withdrawn yet. So there are still several parts of that territory that are still contested, such as the Sheba farms, among others. And first, and also at the such line is still contested, but notwithstanding the very tense situation that we see in South Lebanon since October 7 and the progressive escalation, I think we see, that area, that part of the world has been relatively stable since 1978, apart from the big Israeli-Hezbollah war of 2006, which then reinforced the mission. There are currently 15,000 troops deployed there that are supervising that separation line. So there is, of course, the big, in terms of us say consent at the United Nations, that would look like something, that Ukraine would need to give consent, and that would be, something to be discussed, and it would be very clear that these are territories that have been occupied by Russia and that should be returned to Ukraine eventually. But ultimately, I don't think a Russia's veto with a draft resolution that is kind of careful would be so unthinkable. We have seen that in the case of the Israeli-Lebanese war, and everybody was expecting that there would have been a veto situation from the United States. I'm just thinking hypothetically, but I think these are the kinds of negotiated settlement options that we seriously need to think about. And of course, there is a risk of a freezing conflict, and it would make it intractable, but it would really put an end to the suffering of thousands of combatants and civilians on the ground. And this is where, again, the Transatlantic Alliance has a really important role to play for pushing and proposing for these options, cognizant, and maybe not many people know this, that United Nations peacekeeping has actually helped save 100,000 of lives. So estimates suggest that over a 12-year period, UN peacekeeping is able to save 150,000 lives in comparison to a scenario in which a peacekeeping mission is absent. The second and last point that I'll make very briefly is that the second big mistake for the Transatlantic Alliance is that there is a risk of overlooking how the alliance fares in relation to the rest of the world. So the Transatlantic Alliance should remind itself that it does not operate in a vacuum and should try to better understand what happens with the rest of the world. I think Natalie Tocci on the political put it bluntly a few weeks ago. She wrote, "We no longer live in a world where we can ignore what everyone thinks and wants." But instead of framing it as threats, I think that the Transatlantic Alliance should really think about building bridges. And so Tocci was referring to Europe alone, but I would argue that this applies to the whole Transatlantic Alliance, although perhaps to a lesser extent to the US and to the EU. So this realization entails, I think, 3 steps that are really important. First, the Transatlantic Alliance needs to deeply understand what is actually going on. And I think maybe that sounds very dull, but it's just, that's what I mean. So the wake-up call, I think, came for all members of the Transatlantic Alliance when there was this General Assembly decision at the United Nations denouncing Russia's violation of international law and calling for Russia's withdrawal from Ukrainian territory. 140 countries voted in favor, which was pretty good results. But demographically, most of the world still lived in countries that voted against. And at that point, I think that there was a wake-up call, at least for the European Union and for European countries. And they realized that Europe realized that it had to listen to frustrations and offer something offer something else. And to be fair, Europe tried to do that. They linked, for instance, the global gateway to New India, to the Middle East Europe corridor, pushing very much these initiatives. They expanded their outreach, appointing officers and ambassadors. And some even say that the G20 success in India is part of that effort actually pushed by the Transatlantic Alliance. So the point is really to deal and focus on those countries that are neither in favor, because those are already won, but that they are against. Not those that are against, but those that are somewhere in between, that gray zone. And really sort of also become aware, that's particularly true, I think, for the European Union, to become aware that it, to some extent, it has become kind of irrelevant in the Middle East. The EU has lost dramatically its credibility in the Middle East, but it has also, by doing so, also weakened its position in Ukraine. So by fundamentally understanding what's going on a little bit more carefully, I think that would really help. The second point that I would like to make is also to work more on the self-awareness of the image problem of the transatlantic alliance. So that comes with a little bit the Mearsheimer argument that I think Keir was talking about. So the perception of double standards, that ultimately the transatlantic alliance is keen to protect universal norms when it serves the alliance well, but not under all conditions. And I think that's a real problem. The other big problem is the fact that oftentimes the alliance makes it look it's going to follow a truly, genuinely multilateralist agenda, but it doesn't really. Famously, a few months ago, Olaf Scholz spoke in front of the General Assembly at the United Nations, and he was standing in front of basically a half-empty room, and not even Macron or Sunak had bothered to show up, just to give you a sense that maybe that often spoken about commitment to multilateralism is not truly and genuinely believed in, even not in European countries that write that very loudly. And then the third and last point I would like to make in this second part is that, and that's really kind of the good news, I guess, or where the transatlantic alliance should push towards, is to continue to try to pursue the road of building bridges among those many countries that are not openly against it. So, and I think this could be done in two spaces where we see some progress. So the first space is in the corridor of the United Nations. So the transatlantic alliance, as divergent as it may be, should do much, much more to understand what happens in the global arena. And notwithstanding the extremely restricted space, the obvious flaws in the decision-making structure of the United Nations, which really represents an order, liberal order of the past, the United Nations remain a space of socialization and dialogue with some serious tools that could be put to use if we did not continue to, fit into only deterrence will save us kind of narrative. And then the second point and last point that I would like to make is the fact that the second solution, I believe, in building bridges lies in actually telling the story of what actually happens on the ground and the very dirty roads where negotiations take place. To illustrate, I do believe that one of the reasons why we have yet to see a full-fledged escalation in South Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah is the fact that we have the continuous efforts by, notably by Secretary of State Blinken, as well as by Amos Hochstein that is helping him out, but also the really strong presence of a lot of European troops, including many other troops from all over the world, including France, Finland, Italy, Spain, that deploys thousands of troops in South Lebanon, and actually every week meet the Lebanese armed forces and the Israeli defense forces to talk about the continued security incidents. And I think there is a lot of potential in this micro-level multilateralism, or at least some potential. But given the situation, I think we should exploit that as well. So to conclude, I believe that the future of the transatlantic alliance hinges on the ability for the alliance in its various configurations to navigate this complex reality, avoiding to construct a we-them narrative. So the threat narrative, I don't think is particularly useful, for instance. And there is a serious risk that the alliance becomes inward-looking and embarks on a major navel-gazing exercise that it remains ultimately unable to act for stability, deeply understand what's going on in this contemporary international system, and also it's going to lead the alliance ultimately to miss opportunities for stabilizing. So there are, as I said, additions to deterrence that should not be overlooked, even in the case of Ukraine. And second, there is a risk of overlooking how the alliance fares in relation to the rest of the world. Neither obviously are easy to do, but both are more crucial than ever for the future of the transatlantic relationship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara. You covered so much ground that I don't really know where to start, but I'm sure that there will be a number of questions on that. But your remarks suggested to me to make two comments in this respect. The first one is, because one of the paradoxes of the conflict that is underway is that is more than a war between Russia and Ukraine and less than a war between Russia and NATO. And it is in this gray zone still now. Some experts have compared already the conflict with the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Aggression from the north, this time around aggression from the east, initial breakthrough, then a very powerful response from the south in Korea and from the west here, and then stalemate. After 1 year, 1 year and a half, stalemate, and a stalemate that lasted quite a while because the war came to some sort of end only in 1953. And how did it end? Not with a peace treaty. It ended with a ceasefire, a green line to divide the two territories, a minimal UN Security Council resolution just to sanction the situation on the ground. But ever since, many things have changed. I mean, South Korea today is in a quite nice place. I think it has taken time, decades, but the West has invested on South Korea has invested on the West. Is this a possible scenario for I mean, we look very far down the horizon. I think that the main difficulty at this stage is that although you correctly say that lines of communication and dialogue with Moscow must remain open, it is very difficult politically to do this in this situation. Nobody wants to do what the Prime Minister of Hungary has done, to go to Moscow and shake hands with President Putin. President Macron apparently had a long phone conversation with Moscow, and his foreign minister did the same just a couple of days ago. This is probably something that has to stay in place, and I think lines of communication are open. But what Putin wants is not a micro-level multilateral solution. He wants a macro level. But he wants a deal with Washington on the future of European security. That is where our difficulty lies in this particular respect. And I would not entirely agree with you in emphasizing European strategic autonomy at this stage. I think actually, paradoxically, one of the side effects of the conflict has been a sort of toning down of the rhetoric on strategic autonomy. Now, even in official documents, you find reference to increasing our strategic autonomy and improving cooperation with the US and NATO. It's always in the same sentence. Because Europeans have discovered that, after all, NATO is still the deterrent of last resort, if I may borrow from John Maynard Keynes, that it needed in this situation. So it is a very difficult balancing act for Europeans in this respect. I mean, increasing strategic autonomy is okay. We will have at some stage probably to put our money where our mouth is, and I think that could be one of the added values of the European Union in this respect, and particularly when it comes to defense industry and so on and so forth, but it is still quite a challenge, and the situation remains very volatile. But personally, I believe that right now, the time for multilateralism is not ripe yet, and I would like your comments on that. Multilateralism is also about power. Multilateralism works best when there is a balance of power that's somehow established. It worked between 1945 and 1948, before there was a challenge to that balance of power with the Cold War, and it worked immediately after the end of the Cold War. There was even a golden age of multilateralism because the unilateral moment was shaping the international system. But when that order is contested by the Soviet Union during the Cold War and the number of actors today, multilateralism has trouble working. And therefore, I think we have to be much more patient in this respect. It is not an alternative, but it is something that at some stage we can bring to bear in the situation if the situation on the ground comes to some sort of arrangement on a dividing line between what is controlled by Russia and what is not. But I would like to have your take on that.
Thank you so much for these comments. So on your first point, I agree. This is very much a gray zone, right? And it's very difficult to find a political situation. And I agree. Time is not ripe for a political situation. But the point is that we are not going to, again, the sort of Ukrainian defense forces are most likely not going to win the war. Unfortunately, I think this is what seems to emerge from the strategic, operational, and tactical reality that we are unfolding. And so we need to, at the same time, we need to stop that suffering. That would really be my main argument. And we have a responsibility to stop that suffering, even without a political solution. And we know that there are technical solution that can be found. And I think that the example on Korea is extremely interesting, and it's exactly along the similar dimension that I was thinking about when I talked about the Israeli-Lebanese sort of situation in South Lebanon. It's a similar situation. So I think that the UN intervention there really contributed in a way to freeze the conflict. But I think these are the kinds of scenario that I think we need to think more seriously about. And also, incidentally, the Korean example is an interesting one because it's one in which there was a Uniting for Peace resolution with a General Assembly that voted very much in favor of an intervention with blue helmets that were deployed. So I think that the solution paradoxically lies in the technicality of it, in deploying, in using the tools that were developed by very creative, if I can use that word, very creative norm entrepreneurs in the United Nations, and those norm entrepreneurs exist also within NATO and within the NATO alliance to find solutions that can put at least a transient stop to this dire situation. And so I think that I agree very much with you that the situation, the time is not right for a political solution, but from what we see, from what research also shows, oftentimes we can put an end to a conflict even without the time being right, but by creating conditions for then developing a political solution. A political solution that oftentimes never arrives, as it was the case with the two Koreas and as it is the case with Israel and Lebanon, to be fair. So there is a big risk of freezing the conflict, but maybe it's better, this is better than the alternative. That would be my argument. And to your second point, I agree with you. So the classical, conventional state-level multilateralism, I would maybe even argue, its space is very restricted. Some argue it's dead, and time is not ripe for that. But I think that there is a lot of vitality in a lot of micro-level multilateralism, and there is research being done on this. That is kind of interesting, where there are solutions that are being found on the ground for making humanitarian aid arrive. And these are the solutions that, in this extremely dire situation, we need to work with a bit more seriously than we are doing, I think.
Thank you so much. And as the Monty Python would say, and now something completely different. No, not really. No, not really. Brian, you are expected to talk about the challenge and opportunities of new technologies, also in this context, AI and beyond, I would say, not just AI strictly.
Sure. So I lead Accenture's global public sector business, which is defense, healthcare, and public service. And I think that I spend a lot of time with European military, NATO, US, and beyond. For me, the battlefield is much bigger than Ukraine. It's connected, but I think the true strategic realities are that all of the conflicts globally are connected around 3 or 4 key adversaries. And so I don't view Russia and Ukraine as a contained problem to be looked at. And I think part of the reason it is been virtualized globally is because of the emergence of electronic warfare, AI-powered cyber, disinformation, deep fakes. There's really a global war going on. And I think that you mentioned strategic autonomy. I think the geostrategic reality is that transatlantic relationships in terms of defense cooperation are getting a lot stronger. And I think there's an agreement that generative AI is really critical because our adversaries are already Gen AI natives, and that's not limited to Russia. It's limited to groups operating in transatlantic criminal organizations that are connected to nation states. And I think the battleground is a lot more complicated than troops on the border between Russia and Ukraine. I think that's a very simplistic interpretation of the challenges that are being faced. And I was at the Munich Security Conference. I was in Vilnius over the summer. I think the commitment on the part of transatlantic defense enterprises is stronger than I've ever seen it. I think that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, so NATO is now bigger, stronger, and more funded than it's ever been. And I think you're seeing significant budget procurements in Poland, Lithuania, Finland, Sweden. Massive capital allocations in Europe are moving into the defense sector in response, yes, to Russia, but also in response to the strategic recognition that Russia is operating in combination with other adversaries. And this is just a fact. So I think you've got this very strong geostrategic imperative that is driving the adoption of AI and generative AI solutions because we are already under attack in terms of cyber disinformation, ransomware, critical infrastructure, and the boundaries of physical and territorial control and electronic and virtual control are being blurred by technology. And so I think that's created a, kind of the ground is shifting under everybody's feet at the same time. I'm not sure that Russia has a strategic advantage as those things change. The second factor that's emerging is that it's not quite strategic autonomy from a geostrategic perspective, but the AI industrial base is now a reality. Most countries realize that they're going to need access to massive amounts of compute. They already have data, but they're going to need to be building their own sovereign AI solutions, not just because of national security, because of climate security, health, to remain competitive in the marketplace. If you're a large multinational corporation or a national champion and you're not operating with the same margins and efficiency of another country, then your stock prices you're going to get down. It's going to be kind of a negative industrial cycle. So I think national security and the AI industrial base within most economies is becoming more and more correlated because of how important just compute is. And if you look at the kinds of deals that NVIDIA is doing, for example, selling massive amounts of computer chips directly into being procured directly by nations, it's because every country is recognizing that they need to start building their own AI industrial base. And that's just kind of the foundation. On top of that, you're going to need services, you're going to need entirely new skills, a workforce. And so this isn't necessarily directly refuting or supporting any political statements, but I'm seeing a tremendous amount of integration and procurement activity in support of multilateralism. If you look at initiatives like AUKUS, Five Eyes, and you include the UK, and you buttress the transatlantic relationship between the US and Europe to Australia, Japan, Singapore, parts of Southeast Asia, it's not just the United States and Europe, right? There's a much more complicated network of defense integration and activity that I don't think is in the interest of Russia and China long term. And so that may actually help with a negotiated outcome. I mean, I think we all would like to see this war end. I don't think anybody would have predicted in the first 24 hours of Russia's incursion into Ukraine that this war would not be over by now. I think everybody assumed that Russia would prevail much earlier. And while they may have reconstituted their forces, they've lost tremendous leverage with China. China has now emerged as the winner, I think much more than Putin. And China's economy is not necessarily stronger, and maybe it will get better. I think it's hard to predict the future, but I don't think it's as easy to say now that they're winners and losers as a result of what's happening. There's some very important nested ethical, moral, and challenges around the role of artificial intelligence in defense. The European Data and AI Act is an incredible step forward, I think, in clarifying for industry, what kind of the risk tolerance is for specific applications of generative AI. There are carve-outs for defense enterprises specifically. We're already seeing AI creep into the battlefield in a pretty unique way in Ukraine, led by Ukraine, actually. I mean, they are setting the standard for innovation on the battlefield way more than Russia, considering they're outmaneuvered, outgunned, and out-soldiered. So there's some very important work to be done, not just in the transatlantic relationship, but globally around building a consensus around how does AI fit into the battle space. It's kind of emerging, it's happening, but there is no current consensus around this. It isn't the first time we've seen this. In World War I, you had a huge reaction to the automation of weaponry on the battlefield, the use of mustard gas. I mean, it's kind of the same parallel, right? All of this new technology had a very traumatic impact on Europe, and as a result, there were conventions and agreements after World War I. Hopefully we get there sooner, but I think that we can't underestimate the danger of a conflict that escalates because of autonomous systems. I mean, it's a very dangerous probability unless there is a global consensus on how to really govern, manage, and secure AI within the construct of national security. The challenge is all of our systems in France today are under attack every single day, powered by generative AI weapons, whether it's deepfakes, cyber attacks, identity theft, attacking critical infrastructure. So I think Europe and the United States and our allies are in a very weird situation because we cannot risk not adopting generative AI or AI as part of our arsenal because our adversaries are already doing it at scale. And it's much more expensive to defend yourself with generative AI than to weaponize it. So I think there's some really important ethical and moral challenges nested within the emergence of AI autonomy in the battlefield. I think that there's also an entire industry emerging to help manage AI and its deployment and its security and make it transparent, explainable. But I think we're still a ways off before, there isn't really AI being adopted at scale. It's mostly solving task-specific productivity problems. And this is true in industry as well as public sector. Right now, AI is really being used to solve backlogs, productivity, roadblocks. How do you exploit and understand massive amounts of data that are coming in at low latency volumes that we've never seen before? The complexity of analyzing geospatial intelligence. You just can't hire your way out of some of these problems of high complexity. So I think you're going to see a real emergence of kind of a new economy around, not necessarily the use of AI in the battlefield, but how defense enterprises are going to be transformed by AI. I'm not, I think, naive. The war in Ukraine could lead to lots of unintended consequences. But I will say, in my personal experience, I have never seen more defense cooperation between the United States and Europe, and more conversations and continued dialogue, not just about AI and defense systems, but about how to closer integration, devising data sharing, which is a huge issue when everybody's got classified information. You can't really share information. So interoperability between systems. So it may not happen soon enough, and it may not counter some of the geostrategic effects that we're describing, but NATO is really at the heart of this because they're not developing new technology. They're really kind of an orchestrator, a referee, a driver, and I think NATO's position within Europe is getting stronger, and as a result, within the transatlantic relationship is getting stronger. I'm not going to comment on what could happen in the United States if the election goes one way or the other, but I think that as it is now, defense enterprises are very clear about what their priorities are. And I do not think they're exaggerating the threat posed by Russia, because it's not just Russia. It's Russia acting in combination with multiple adversaries who have totally different agendas, but are aligned around a single purpose, which is to weaken Europe and the United States.
Yes, thank you. I mean, we are treading a little bit into the topics discussed in the previous panel that is about regulation and the digital sphere. And personally, I agree with you with the increased transnational cooperation among like-minded countries within NATO and beyond. But what about the others? I mean, of course, the main challenge here is that the others don't want to be regulated the same way and do not agree on the same principles and limitations. And this is, to some extent, a classical challenge for regulating new technologies. I mean, if you look back over the past decades, it first started with nuclear weapons, but also was extended to other areas. And of course, a certain technology has first to reach a certain level of maturity before the main actors, at that time state actors, could realize that a degree of limitation or self-limitation had to be achieved. It has happened with nuclear weapons and also other tools in this respect. In general, regulation comes after a while, doesn't come right away. In this particular case, there is a sector-specific challenge. That is, these new technologies are not developed top-down, with funding coming from governments, from states, but they are developed bottom-up they are developed by the private sector, they go to markets, and then some of them are weaponized or can get used in conflicts. And therefore, the regulation framework, the setting is completely different. And it is a sort of moving target in technological terms, because even if you manage to regulate a certain sector, a few years from now, it could be widely outdated and easily be circumvented. And on the other hand, I mean, who is pushing for regulation? There is a certain pressure for some sort of, how could I put it, highway code that could be agreed on the use of these tools. But so far, China, that is the main challenger in this particular domain, has never reacted to an invitation of this kind. So I wonder whether we should be more innovative. I would like to ask you what you think could be done in this respect, because some people have raised concerns about the use of AI, in particular generative AI, in security and defense. I still remember a sort of rant by the late Henry Kissinger, who wrote a famous article saying this is the end of enlightenment and machine will control man and so on and so forth. But Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, recently went public and said, hey, we have to do something because there are dangers, inherent dangers in all this. Now, what I see lacking here, and would like to have your take, is guys like you making a public case for some sort of discipline in this field. I mean, in the past, it was epistemic communities that contributed to international regulations of risky technologies. It was the atomic scientists during the Cold War. Think of earth scientists for climate change. I mean, the kind of case that they made for reducing CO2 emissions and setting targets to that effect. In this domain, there is a lack of an epistemic community, in part because it is not developed in state universities, it is developed in the private sector, in startups, and so on and so forth, and therefore there is no inherent interest on the part of those actors to play a role in this field. But I think that is something that will be on the agenda sooner or later. The only alternative would be that would be such a disaster, and only a disaster would bring people to the table to try and regulate the technology. What do you think about that?
So I think that, I mean, you're seeing Europe make, I think, progress in terms of regulating many of the technology companies, right? I think there's a movement. And I think the US is watching closely because I don't think there's necessarily popular aversion to that regulation because privacy issues are involved, right, in ways that are, I think, unique and touch everybody. So I think there's going to be, and it is already emerging in Europe, a stronger regulatory environment for a lot of the, we call them hyperscalers, right, the large tech companies. I think in terms of Accenture, you know, we are doing something very interesting, which is I can't just go out and sell AI. It has to meet a very rigid set of legal performance, transparency, explainability, performance requirements before we can put anything into the hands of a customer, even if they're paying us to do it. Right? So I think industry plays a role. We're a systems integrator, so it's in our interest to be very conservative because we don't want to be liable for deploying a system that has unintended consequences. So I think you're going to see some of the same liability issues are going to drive behavior of putting AI systems.
Thank you very much. Now, the floor is open. We have half an hour maximum for a good debate. There is a lot of stuff to be addressed. So who would like to start? Shoot on the pianist. Ooh. I would come with the micro. Okay, the closer the better. We collect 2 or 3 questions each time, otherwise we cannot manage.
Thank you.
Please be sharp and short.
Thank you for excellent presentation. Cécile Prodex, Research Associate at Pacte Sciences Po Grenoble. Should the transatlantic relations be strengthened? How to reinforce them without reinforcing the growing narrative of a global South versus a global North, or a global West seen from Russia, and in particular considering the different perspectives of the US and the EU on China. Thank you.
Okay, let's stay on the my left, Anna, and then we will move to the other side. It's at the back.
Thank you very much for this discussion. My question is regarding the latest European Union industrial strategy. And given the fact that the European Commission now is debating, first of all, to buy more European and buy more together, and even to the extent of having in the new European Commission a dedicated commissioner post for defense industry, in what way do you think it will impact, if it will have any impact on the transatlantic relations? Thank you.
We'll take a third question, and then we come back to the panel. Here? Here.
Thank you very much for your discussion. I also want to thank you in particular, Professor Chiara Ruffa, because it's a narrative that I don't hear very much, and it's really it's really important to hear it, at least when we talk about defense and we talk about security. So I'm a student of Sciences Po. I study international development, but the reason why I'm here today is because as youth, the narrative in the media by politicians is a realist narrative focused on the inevitability of war and also the banalization, I feel, of war. And I see it in the media and I see it in the discourse. And I was wondering, and this is especially for Professor Chiara Ruffa, but for everyone, do you see a potential enlargement, not enlargement, but like a more popularization of this discourse that looks at alternatives and at a non-realist view of the word, which is not how the word is, it's just a choice of how the word we want, like the word we want to see. So I was wondering, yes, how big is the potential? Where are we on the conversation? How positive can we be about the alternatives? And this is, I think, is especially important for youth because we are the generation that might face a future war. We feel it very we feel it very real, very close. So thank you again for your answer.
Thank you. We'll come back to the panel, starting with Keir, so you can have the floor again, and then we'll move towards me, and everybody can pick whatever you like from the questions. There is something for everyone, I think.
Okay. NATO was formed as a military alliance, right, to confront a military threat, a massive conventional, kinetic military threat, okay? That's what I've studied, I look at. I do unfortunately see that the tragedy of international politics is the frequent and repeated occurrence of war and military conflict. These are the areas that I study all the rest. 10 years ago, if and when I did give talks like this in Europe, I was seen as a dinosaur. War is obsolete. Europeans don't talk about being German anymore or Italian anymore. They talk about being European. Okay, and I was like, maybe they got a point. With respect to, viewing security in a broader perspective, with respect to viewing threats in a new light, or to go beyond threats, I'm all for it. I think it's great. I have no problem with that. But for me, the biggest problem are when nation states go to war on a large scale, like we've seen in Ukraine, and as the United States and China may do in East Asia. And now there are all these spots around the world where it's not just in theory anymore that could happen. So
The need for an alternative complementary narrative, and one that is actually the overarching narrative. And I think the deterrence element for me is just one component of a much bigger narrative that actually sees as a peace instead of war as a starting point of international politics. And the reason why I decided to talk about this is that I've been very frustrated about the complete lack of such narrative. There was a strategic forum in Paris a few weeks ago, and I haven't heard the word peace once being mentioned as a desirable goal. And I think we have a problem with that if we just focus on the deterrent side. This doesn't mean that we should not be careful, that we should not prepare for we should not be able to defend ourselves. To the contrary, I think we need to be careful. The situation is dire. There are mounting threats. But I think that what is going to get us out of this situation is not being able to fight the next war, but being able to build bridges and see things more comprehensively with war as a desirable end state. So your question was, do I see a popularization of this? Absolutely not, which is one of the reasons why I decided to talk about it. And I think it's a real problem. It's a real problem that we can't talk about it anymore. So in the space of 6 months, a year, that narrative that maybe some of my U.S. colleagues were perceiving as this very European narrative, about normative power, it has disappeared in Europe, off the radar, nowhere to be found. And I think that's sort of the real problem with that. It's neither or, but we need to talk about we should not normalize war as a current state of way of solving controversies in the international system. I think that's my fundamental starting point. So to be fair, in the academic debate, there is a lot of that. But these are more often maybe spaces in which then we don't engage enough with policymakers. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity to be able to maybe bring this forward. But I think much more needs to be done. And I think it's also a duty and a responsibility we have towards the next generations that are confronted with this overwhelming threats and dire situation. And I think my narrative mine was just an attempt to try to change that narrative, and I hope we could do more to do that. And to your question, it's a very difficult question. So I think that it's again about not. I'm also going to use the term global south, global north, knowing that it's a very highly imperfect term, right? We just use it for having a conversation. But I think that this building bridges approach really is a way to not to treat the global south as a complete unicum, but to engage in conversation with multiple actors in the global south or anywhere that are not openly against the global north, and try to sort of maybe bring try to construct together, not bring them on board, but not bring them on board in a patronizing way, but really construct together a rule-based world with the centrality of the United Nations. So I think this is all very idealistic and hypothetical. But I think, so NATO, as enshrined in the UN Charter, as any other regional organization, should fit that role, I think, should fit the role of a regional organization which has defensive purposes. And that should be the role in relation to a much more UN-based global architecture. So I think that NATO should be strengthened, just to answer your question, NATO should be strengthened to the extent in which it serves defensive deterrence purposes.
Thank you, Chiara.
Thanks. So, yeah, I think the Global South is a very strategic, emerging, I think very important, but unfortunately more in the context of almost a Cold War dynamic where if Ukraine is a proxy war, then both sides are seeking to obtain kind of a fault line by attracting allies that are of strategic importance, either because of natural resources or geographic position. So I think the Global South is extremely important because it's kind of being ignored as a result of Ukraine. I mean, it's sucking all the oxygen out of the global narrative. So I'm not in discussions with international institutions or NGOs, but I just feel like it has kind of fallen off the radar. And part of that is really what I'm observing in the media, and I used to be a radio and TV producer in war zones, is that there seems to be an inverse proportion now between the amount of information and the empathy that's being generated. It's like a very complicated dynamic, is that people are desensitized, I think, to a lot of the real impact that war has on people. It's been saturated. And so I think the Global South, at least in many of the discussions, is starting to emerge as a much stronger topic. And clearly there's the same problem traditionally of resources, digital divide, education. I mean, a lot of those drivers of instability are still there. And I just don't think the resources or sophistication are going to emerge fast enough to really address the Global South holistically in ways that would be much different from how we have been doing it in the past. And as far as the narrative around war, it's just, I think social media has had a tremendously weird impact on giving so much information with such low latency. It may not even be true, that people, I think, are like not sure if the information they're getting is true or false. It's just you're getting saturated with lots of information. So I think it's a very interesting problem, like why people don't care more, right? Like, why don't they care, right? You see these images and it's just like, you know, people go on with their lives. So, you know, I can't comment on why. It's just something I observe as a former TV and radio producer. I think part of it is that social media has a really fragmented effect on the economic model that used to drive the level of depth of reporting in a lot of these areas. Most news organizations cannot afford to send people to the Global South to really report on some of the deeper issues there, because there's no way to monetize that story. And social media is kind of filling a vacuum, but is the information that's going into that vacuum deep enough, accurate enough, researched enough, really to move policymakers or citizens to feel differently? I just don't know. But I think a weird effect of AI is news organizations, because of the massive amounts of data they have, I think you're going to start to see a new economic model emerge that strengthens media organizations' ability to invest in information in ways that I think over the last 15 years they've been unable to since the advent of social media. Because, you know, the New York Times, for example, is taking on OpenAI because a lot of the, you know, their reporting that they invested in and paid for in the Global South and the Global North, it doesn't matter. It is tremendous value from an artificial intelligence standpoint. And so I think you're going to see a little bit of a change in the economic model around information that ideally benefits improving quality over velocity.
Thank you. So we have time, I think, for the last round, starting with Sergey, and then we move on there, provided you are short in your remarks or comments or questions, okay?
Thank you. I would like to comment on why people don't care in the Global South, and then I'll have a question for Keir. I think we hear from people in southern countries that this is not our war, this is European war. Where were you when we had a war here, here, and here? Why do you have a minute of silence for Ukrainian victims, for victims of the conflict in the Middle East, and not for Ethiopian civil war, Tigray war? With all the tragedy in Ukraine, apparently there were more victims in Ethiopia. And why did you have less empathy for Syrian refugees than for Ukrainian refugees? And unfortunately, the answers are very difficult to this question. And so as you can imagine, that double standards, all that Keir was talking about, are right there, front and center. So I have a question for Keir. I'm missing something in your argument about NATO expansion. You said that NATO expansion provoked this war. On the other hand, you said Putin has no way to attack NATO countries, right? He doesn't want to attack NATO countries. So NATO actually is a deterrent, which actually means it's a very successful alliance. Article 5 was triggered only once, right? It was attack 9/11, 2001. So if NATO doesn't have threats, that probably means that nobody can even want to be considered as a threat of NATO, because it makes no sense, right? I don't know. It's something is missing in the following sense. NATO countries have not been attacked. New NATO members have not been attacked by Putin. Non-members have Russian soldiers everywhere. There are Russian soldiers in Belarus, Russian soldiers in Moldova, Russian soldiers in Georgia, Russian soldiers in Armenia, Russian soldiers in Belarus, right? So if Ukraine joined NATO, do you think Putin would have attacked Ukraine? Ukraine didn't want to join NATO. Yeah, of course.
You're going to collect more? You want me to I've got this one's on. Well, very quick. I'm not sure I can do that, but look, this is so bizarre, okay? People like me said, do not ignore Russian security fears after the Cold War. When they say, do not move NATO up to our border, I believe them. My European friends and other NATO allies and plenty of Americans who love NATO said, oh, that's ridiculous. The war narrative is no longer relevant. The deterrence narrative is no longer relevant. You know, this is just a vestige of Russian Tsarism, or, Putin is a KGB person. So, and people like me said, no, this is a bad idea. 99, we expand NATO, first tranche. Second tranche, 2001. 2008, NATO promises that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. I mean, the die is, to then say, well, why is Russia acting so aggressively towards Georgia and Ukraine? If only they had been included in NATO, we wouldn't have had this war. That's effectively what you're saying. It's exactly the opposite. It was the threat, the danger that those countries would end up being in NATO that led Russia to take action. And it's all part of Russia's sphere of influence, interpretation, et cetera, which we can, debate whether they have the validity to that or, whatsoever. But it's so ironic. It's like blaming the person that told you not to do this, that there'd be trouble, for the trouble that occurs because you ignore. No, I'm using it. I'm saying if Georgia and Ukraine had not been promised NATO membership in 2008, you might not have gotten the war against Georgia. You might not have gotten the war in Ukraine. It's a strange thing. And again, I'll just leave it with, I think it's a nice point about this war narrative and the deterrence narrative. I mean, I get it. I believe international politics is a tragic condition where it's not that war is desirable. God, it's exact opposite. It's terrible. It's not that I'm trying to normalize war. I would love to get rid of war. But the reality is that the cost of ignoring the war narrative and the deterrence narrative directly led to the Ukraine war. It was because Europeans thought that, hold on. I'm also, hold on. No, I'm keeping it very simple because I want to make the point that those who argued that war was obsolete were the ones who thought expanding NATO doesn't matter for Russian security. Because how could they be so concerned that we're not going to attack them? They ignored Russian security fears. I'm putting a very fine line on this because I want you to understand that some of us were actually saying that at the time, and sure enough, it comes true. And then you blame us for, talking about war and deterrence. You tell me what's going on. I believe it. Reality is socially constructed, 100%. But it keeps being constructed in the same way over and over and over again. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe we can change someday. As long as we live in a nation-state system with anarchy and uncertainty and military capabilities, I think we're going to face these problems over and over again. And we do ourselves no favors by burying our head in the sand.
Stop working, so we'll speak. Listen, personally speaking, I would agree that the Bucharest decision was awful. It was the worst possible decision that could be adopted by NATO, saying Georgia and Ukraine will be in NATO, but doing nothing to make that happen, no giving parameters for that exercise. I wouldn't buy into the rest of your argument that it is our fault for what happened. But I mean, we have to stop it now because otherwise we continue. We can do it over the coffee break. I would like to give the floor to those who asked for the micro at the back, but there is no micro. Sorry.
Hi. I first off like to thank the panelists for the very lively discussion today. Thank you very much for being here. My questions are directed, however, at Mrs. Ruffa and Mr. Lieber. I think it's a very interesting perspective you present, Mr. Lieber. However, I would starkly disagree especially with regard to the current military situation in Ukraine. If I understood you correctly, you anticipate that this will, at least in the long term or potentially in the midterm, lead to a frozen conflict, and that this is inevitably this is not a winnable war. I, however, disagree, and I personally hold that the nuclear threats of Putin to be very cheap. I don't take much stock in them. I think, if anything, we need to be restocking Ukraine, rearming Ukraine, and we need to be launching military attacks on the Crimean Peninsula. I think that's the only thing that would really force Putin into negotiations. So I guess my question to you would be, what are the guiding factors that are determining your assessment that the nuclear threat is a real one? I do not believe personally that that's a credible threat, also for the simple fact that I think the United States also poses, and NATO as well, a credible threat. So that would be the one side. And then, Ms. Ruffa, my question to you with regard to the human security aspect. I think a lot of the elements you talk about correlate pretty highly to various approaches we see in things like feminist foreign policy approaches, placing human security at the forefront. However, I think those approaches, although I would like to value them, I don't think that they are pursuable in a situation where you are dealing with a counterpart whose committedness to these goals is, in my estimation, not present. Thank you very much. Sorry if that was a long question.
There was
Thank
another
you.
hand at the back.
Yeah,
Quick and short, and then
I just wanted to say that we can go 10 minutes over time to answer the questions if it's okay for everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ruben. I study international security here at Sciences Po. With my question, I would like to connect a little bit to the issue of the EU that has already been raised. Now, the discussion has painted a very bleak background picture, sort of like circulating around US disengagement in Europe. And with my question, I would like to look a little bit more into the future, like 5, 6, 7 years. And over the past 2 years, we've seen a lot of development and integration in the European CSDP. And I would like to ask you, and it's probably a very broad question, whether the future European security architecture, in your opinion, will center more around NATO or the European Union with, well, Atlanticist and more Europeanist countries on the European continent.
thank you. We'll close the floor now. Any closing argument on your part? Quick and short.
Look, I'm opposed to escalating the Ukraine war. War is not the answer. Continuing those war is not the answer. People are dying, and there's nothing to be gained from it. I guarantee, the Korean War analogy was a great one to bring up. We can see where this is going to end. It's probably going to end on a stalemate along the lines of territorial control about now. It's just got to stop. I think what I would say on the nuclear escalation issue, I have an article in Foreign Affairs magazine in October that lays out the rationality of nuclear escalation. I just refer you to that rather than take the time here. When I concluded and I said one of the things we should do is have an honest appraisal of the threat to NATO and to Europe and to the European transatlantic security threat. I didn't say it explicitly, but I think it would show that we do not face a military threat and the kind of threat that people are talking about NATO military power being, necessary for. I think the outcome of that appraisal would result in people saying we don't need to spend 2% of our GDP on defense. We should spend it on, migration control and assistance, an environment, climate change. I have other priorities I think are more important. So if you thought that I was saying, let's focus on threat because I think that will result in the traditional view of military power and all that, in Europe, I don't see that. You want to talk about Asia, it's a different story, but I plead guilty there.
Chiara.
Just briefly, I think it's important to make a distinction between a war narrative and a deterrence narrative. I think these two things are not the same thing, and I think that distinction really allows us to, potentially continue to work with, build up deterrence because, we need to defend ourselves should anything happen. But at the same time, the war narrative is really a narrative that naturalizes war. And I know that, you per se, you don't like it, but realists have done that since realism was born. Like, by talking about war in a particular way, we are also sanitizing it and making it more bearable to talk about. But of course, we can disagree on that. But I think that distinction between the war narrative and a deterrence narrative is crucial. Second point that I would like to make is that, maybe, NATO expansion triggered this somewhat, but I think we should still talk about Russian expansionism, and I think we need to put it on the table. I think we are talking about a fundamental a leader a big state in international politics that is breaching one of the fundamental universal rules that is the norm of non-aggression, and this is a norm that is acknowledged to be super important at the core across what we call Global South and Global North. It's enshrined in the United Nations Charter. And so in relating to this, I would also say that, yes, sure, the system is anarchic, but it's not anomic. So there are still norms that we need to abide by. And I think a rule-based order is more important than ever. And I do agree that we need to build up deterrence because there are important threats to potentially be ready to fight against, but at the same time, the priority should always be building a rule-based order in a much more global way than we have done so far. Because again, if we only stick to NATO being a military alliance and needing to defend ourselves, we fall again into the war narrative trap. And I have an issue with that. So on alternative approaches, I agree. They are alternative, more critical feminist approaches are difficult to apply in this situation. And part of it is that maybe the core of the conversation has really been taken up by more mainstream approaches to these issues. But I think that feminist human security approaches have a lot to say, and they are not, in a way, they are not necessary. I mean, we can talk and describe how the war is unfolding. They are not necessarily naive. They start from the hidden power structure that we see and observe on the ground. And I think we need to do more to bring them to the forefront and also do more to refine them and make them more, more able to engage in conversation with people that do not share our view.
So I think that, as I said before, I think that the resolve of the transatlantic relationship from a defense perspective is growing stronger. I think there's a perception that we have moral and economic advantage, but it doesn't mean that we make the right decisions or send the right signals that would de-escalate or lead to a negotiated outcome. I think we also need to look at Ukraine in the context of Taiwan, right? I mean, these are kind of weirdly connected. I'm not saying they're the same, but I think there's a calculation as it relates to Taiwan and China that's kind of a subtext to what's happening in Ukraine. But again, just because we may feel like we subscribe to the rule-based system and we have moral and economic advantage, it doesn't mean that we won't trigger a situation in other areas that almost replicate what has happened in Ukraine. And that's not a value judgment, it's just kind of the reality of the complexity of how things seem to evolve. I think looking at the suffering that Putin has caused and the sacrifices he's willing to make of his own people, when he threatens to use a nuclear weapon, I half believe him because he's sacrificed so much to achieve so little already that if the calculation starts to increasingly work against him in terms of his advantage, then in a desperate situation, I wouldn't discount that possibility. I'm not an expert, but I think we can't say with certainty he won't do it because he hasn't done it so far. So I think that's probably top of mind, who in the minds of people who are empowered to defend the citizens of countries in Europe, you can't just ignore those threats. And so I think it does have an impact of, in my opinion, strengthening the transatlantic alliance in ways that may not be visible in the public square, but in terms of interoperability, procurement, defense integration, sharing of information, there's a lot happening that wasn't happening before Ukraine. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, it's just a fact.
until 20, 30 years ago, there was a famous joke in Brussels whereby the EU and NATO were two organizations that were based in the same city but living on different planets. And I think that ever since, I mean, the two organizations have started settling the same territory to some extent, in particular, peace support operations. That is the term that is used. NATO got engaged in the Western Balkans, later on in Afghanistan. The European Union, the same, Western Balkans, Sub-Saharan Africa, in part shortly Afghanistan, off the coast of Somalia, and so on and so forth. This is peace support operation. It's not deterrence and defense. Deterrence and defense is the core mandate of NATO. It's not a mandate for the EU. Read the treaties. The treaties don't say that defense policy in the traditional common defense policy is a mandate for the European Union. CSDP is a different thing. It only says that a common defense policy can be decided by the heads of state and government unanimously. Can be decided. So it is a possibility. It is an enabling norm, but it's not a reality. So it is not in the treaties. The EU, contrary to NATO, doesn't have a military budget. It is prohibited explicitly by the treaties. We have mobilized some money for defense industrial projects so far. The member states outside of the budget has created the European Peace Facility to support aid to Ukraine, but that is not a military budget, which NATO does have. NATO has military headquarters, tested commanders, bases all across the continent. The European Union has a minuscule military headquarters that until a few months ago was not even entitled to carry out executive operations, only military training operations. So this is just to give you a realistic assessment of the state of play. That said, the situations can change. I think that the EU can make a difference in defense industrial policy. Enrico Letta this morning highlighted how little the single market is leveraged by the EU in this respect. And in terms of consolidation, joint procurement, joint investments, even the 2% of GDP, if used differently, would make a difference. During the Cold War, the average defense spending for NATO members was above 3%. Over the decades. There were moments when it was 4%, in particular for some countries, then it went down, but on average it was 3%. Today, it is barely 2%. In fiscal terms, 3% is bearable, is manageable by European economies. The point is how you spend the 3%. And I think that is the big challenge for the EU, and it is an internal challenge. I mean, we have to decide ourselves whether we are ready to operate jointly in that particular field, more courageously, and to make a difference. And perhaps do something together even inside NATO. Today, 23 members of the EU out of 27 are full members of NATO. How come that they cannot coordinate their approach to NATO relations? Yes, I know, Turkey and Cyprus, big issue. Is not completely unsurmountable. It is not completely unsurmountable. There's an article in the Treaty of the EU that says that a number of member states can decide to undertake certain missions for which they are qualified, and that is another enabling clause. It could be approved by constructive abstention. The 4 neutrals could simply stay out, and things could be developed in that particular respect. So there is a lot of work to be done in that particular respect, but presently the EU as such doesn't have a mandate to do what NATO does best. And we all hope, honestly, that NATO continues to do that very well, because it is in our existential interest that that is the case. And with this solemn declaration on my part, I would like to thank the panel for the very good discussion. I think everybody has appreciated that.